Hello, and welcome to Nosotros, the podcast about Mexican-American politics, history, cultura, y más, brought to you in part by the Gomez Law Firm. I'm your host, Elaine Ayala, Metro columnist for the San Antonio Express News. My guests today are Nora Lopez, executive editor of the San Antonio Express News, and more specifically, my longtime editor, and Joey Palacios, engagement producer and intern coordinator for Texas Public Radio. Welcome to Nosotros.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, even though this episode is about the top stories of 2024 here at home and nationally, I still want to start out with a game of rapid-fire questions called This or That. You're both required to answer.
Okay.
New ballpark or Spurs Arena?
Man. Oh, that's tough. So you have to pick between or the
You
other?
have to pick.
Well,
I'll tell you, though, that Ron Nirenberg never picked. He explained both issues, like the nerd he is.
So if I had to pick, all issues, not considered with the whole project. Since TPR is on the west side of downtown, and that would maybe have a lot of revitalization, I'd probably pick the ballpark.
Wow, so self-centered of you. Nora?
I'm going to have to go with the Spurs Arena, but only because, as you know, I'm a huge Spurs fan, have been for many, many years. And just kind of trying to look at the lesser of two evils in terms of, displacement of folks, and the fact that they have pretty much already let the Institute of Texan Cultures just kind of go to waste and just stand there. That it feels to me like a better use.
Yeah. A new face in the mayor's office or one we already know?
Oh, man.
You can go first on this one, Nora.
Please.
I think it's going to be somebody we already know. I think it's going to be one of the city council candidates. There's so many of them, so it's still to be determined, which one of the sitting council members is going to come out as the strongest of all. But I think I tend to think it will be a council member.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. After covering City Hall for about 8 or 9 years, historically we have seen usually somebody who was already a council person going into the mayor's seat. So I think that somebody who has already been on the dais, this is a pretty good chance of winning.
New growth or a slowdown in population increases? You go first this time.
I would say new growth. It's always very exciting, always interesting to have new people, new things going on here, while still retaining that culture is what makes San Antonio great. But yeah, I'd go with the first one.
I got to say new growth too. And I don't know if your question means, do you think more people are moving here or not? Because my thing is, come on, we're nearly 2/3 Latinos. And I just think we're going to continue to populate this city.
Mm-hmm. Austin or the RGV?
Oh, wow.
And by that I mean, we have several leaders, including Henry Cisneros, who talk about these mega regions. And that mega region is always described as Austin, San Antonio, Austin. But, there's always been a general growth coming from across the border, tariffs or no tariffs, of people, things, prosperity from south, north to us. And we are the gateway. That's how I mean it.
Right. Nora, why don't you go first on
Well, I think it makes sense for Austin because it feels like the growth between the two cities just continues to explode, and it feels like it's already kind of this big megaplex. But there's a lot of connections to the valley. It's just that geographically it is a lot further away, so there's still a lot more time to close that. Mm-hmm. But there's definitely a connection to the valley. I'm a prime example, someone originally from the valley who's been in San Antonio now for 30 years or so. But I also see it in some of the stories that we play. When we pick up or when we do stories out of the valley, they get read very well by San Antonio. So San Antonio has a deep interest in what's going on down on the border.
There's familial connections too.
Now, so if you're asking what's going to be the next like Metroplex, it will most likely be San Antonio and Austin, just because of over the last couple of decades, all of the growth that we've seen in all the smaller cities and the population explosion out there, especially like with New Braunfels and the expansion of I-35. We've seen over here on the northeast side of San Antonio with, just trying to control the ingress and egress out of the city by building these 2 double-decker highways now that are currently under construction. I would have to say the next Metroplex would be San Antonio, Austin.
Okay, so this one is also about population growth. More council districts or status quo?
Oh, man. Okay, so when you look at San Antonio and the 1.5-ish million people that we have here, we have 11 members of city council, 10 districts, and the mayor. But when you look at cities like New York, big leap in population, 8 million people living in the city of New York proper, but they have a unicameral, almost legislature-sized city council of 51 elected members.
Can you imagine that?
Right. And so when you look at like the comparison of the number of people that represent the number of representatives and the number of people they represent, it's like I would imagine that the number of people that they represent is smaller. Compared. Yeah. So
because everybody wants representation.
Right. And so I feel like the city would probably benefit to having more council members, a smaller body of people to represent, to take their interests into consideration when they're making those decisions, in a perfect world, of course. But as we've seen in the last census, that's not going to happen probably at least until 2030, because putting additional council members was not part of this recent charter amendment. So we could see that again after the next census.
Status quo. There's too many of them already.
And then they'd have to build another dais and rearrange everything.
That would be a pretty significant
They'd have to get
undertaking.
our producer Monty Block into that situation so he could produce a dais. Okay, my last question, which I ask everybody. Corn or flour?
Oh, flour. Oh, man, absolutely.
Corn.
You've answered like a good diabetic would.
My mom did not know how to make flour, so I grew up really eating corn, and flour was just an occasional and really a breakfast taco thing. Every other meal was corn.
Wow, okay. That was fun. All right, before we get into some of the most notable stories of 2024, I wanted to discuss one story about San Antonio that appeared in Texas Monthly in early December and caused quite a stir. It was by their longtime reporter Mimi Schwartz, who is from San Antonio, and the headline was, "If San Antonio is booming, why is it still so poor?" It's an eternal question, and both the Express News and TPR have asked it many times. Joey, what did you make of it?
So I found this article fascinating because it really put the things that have been talked about for decades in just this very linear perspective of what led to the economic segregation that we see in San Antonio. We, growing up, it was always north side, south side, east side, west side. And even from a very young age, you could already tell the rich side was the north side. The other parts of San Antonio were not as affluent. Even from growing up here, being very young, that perspective was very apparent, whether you saw it in the architecture, whether you saw it in the school districts, whether you saw it, it was just very there. And
it was palpable.
Exactly. And so that's what I really liked about this Texas Monthly article is it just outlined everything, going back even to the 50s and 40s as to what led to that and the type of generational impacts that we still see today.
How about you, Nora?
I mean, yes, that's we all know about redlining and the impact that's had on housing, and it pretty much determined what your fate or fortunes were going to be, what side of the city you grow up in. But I think part of the problem is that we're still overly reliant on, tourism type industry. And so those are not high wages, obviously. But in terms of the city itself growing, I I see a lot of growth in San Antonio.
Positive growth.
Positive growth, yes. Especially on the south side, it feels like lately we've been doing, one story after another about some businesses expanding there. I know that we put a lot of hope on Toyota, you know, 20 plus whatever years ago it was, and it didn't quite materialize. But it feels like now there is some kind of a renewed sense of energy to build, or maybe they finally realize that they can't just go north anymore, they got to go south.
Yeah.
And so it feels like there is a sense that there is some growth now on the south side, which I think will be helpful. But yes, there continue to be a lot of signs that San Antonians in general aren't doing that well financially. We're one of the 10 most populous cities, but I think we're the third in terms of its poorest residents. And so there remains a lot of work. But San Antonio itself, I do feel is on the rise.
It's more energized.
Yeah, there's a lot of growth and just so much new things that weren't even here 10, 15 years ago.
And it's incremental, right? Like, it was an indictment of San Antonio for sure. And even in the callback that Ron Nirenberg wrote, that's on the website right now, it surely did call on all our faults. But at the same time, there is this new energy that I can put not on maybe building, but on Alamo Promise, which ensures at least a 2-year education for kids who graduate from high school here, and then could even allow them to go to UTSA to finish off the degree. And then the other one that's older and just as important is pre-K for SA, which made it possible for every little kid from age 3 up to get some sort of schooling before they land in kindergarten. And we won't see all of those investments right away, maybe when years from now, maybe 10, maybe 20 years from now. Mimi Schwartz is from here, and certainly, and she was from the north side, and certainly talked to people who were willing to say some, and some of them who were not quoted, but were willing to say, yes, we are a poor city, and it was designed that way. And we can't give up that history because it's true, but more is going on than perhaps she gave credit for.
If there's one thing that I can add that I'm really glad was included in here was some of the research that was done by Christine Drennan. One of the things that I remember the most from when I was covering council was a presentation that she gave to the city council probably circa 2015, where she was talking about the economic segregation that San Antonio had over the decades. And for me, it was the first time I'd ever seen it pushed out into or shown in this perspective when it talked about redlining, how neighborhoods like Harlandale did not allow Hispanics to move in. And what just floored me was the fact that Bexar County used to have 60 plus school districts all throughout here. Now we have about 17 school districts,
which still seem too many.
Yeah, and so all of the school districts started consolidating, and the consolidation was based on school districts that were agreed to merge, but it was based on property value.
And so the rich stayed with the rich.
Right. So that's why one of the things, it's not as, Northside is not a property-rich school district. Northeast, at least in the past, has been a property-rich school district. But that's why you see all like Northside being the biggest district, because so many of those consolidated. Same thing with Northeast, but on the south side, you see Harlandale, you see Edgewood, South San Antonio ISD, all of these smaller school districts.
Somerset also, incredibly poor.
That didn't have the means to be able to do that, and the property values there are so much lower. compared to the more affluent houses that you see on the north side that help feed into the budgets of those school districts. And so, when Dr. Drennan was presenting that, it was just so eye-opening to see that is what led to a lot of the economic segregation and just, literal gatekeeping of keeping people from being able to pull themselves out of poverty.
Yeah.
We really need to find a way, the city needs to find a way to consolidate more of those schools, though, because it's still
the fiefdoms that lead to TEA oversight are, as so many of our stories over and over show, it does not lead to good management.
No, and a lot of these folks get elected into these positions with just hundreds of votes. Mm-hmm. Like,
that's all that's there.
That's all that votes. That's all there's there. But they are controlling, multi-million-dollar budgets. Mm-hmm. And that's where these little fiefdoms come, because they're able to provide jobs. They're able to,
the patron system.
Yes, give out contracts, all of those things. Even though there's measures in place to try to make it all even, it's still...
It leads to bad behavior.
It does.
Okay, so now some of the biggest stories, we're not going to cover all of them, but the top one for me had to be the re-election of Donald Trump. And I'm going to pass it over to my editor because I get in trouble a lot for my opinions on Donald Trump. But I'm going to put it in her court first. And especially, Nora, talk about the influence of the Republican Party and the Trump campaign in your home's Rio Grande Valley.
I live in San Antonio, but my mom she just passed away, but she lived in the Valley. So I was in the Valley often. And whenever people ask me, why is, because even before this last election, you were already seeing some signs of the Republicans making inroads in the Valley. And everybody was always so shocked and so surprised. But I wasn't, and I wasn't this time around either. I really believed that Trump was going to win for a long time leading up to the election. And part of it was because I could see it in my friends and my relatives in the Valley. And they tend to fall into, I've had to add a fourth category, but they tended to fall into, those who work in law enforcement in the Valley, and there's a lot because there's so many.
Border Patrol offers so many jobs and is the gateway to improved lives.
Exactly. So I have a lot of relatives who work in law enforcement. Then the cousins who work in the oil fields. Mm-hmm. So they leave and they come up north and, northern Texas, and they work the oil fields and then they go down. So they were getting impacted. Mm-hmm. And then I have a lot of relatives who've become evangelicals and, just super...
they were Catholic before?
And now are evangelicals. And so they're even more strident, it felt, on the issue of abortion than even the Catholics. I don't know, at least in my family.
I think that's true.
It felt that way. Mm-hmm. But over the last few months, I picked up a fourth category among my family, and that was the issue of transgenders.
Their transgender rights.
Rights, yes. They have a hard time understanding the issue, and they boil it down to people wanting to get, sex change operations. And
which isn't true.
No, exactly. But it's a lot of that misinformation that's out there, and a lot of the ads about, that we're airing about Democrats, wanting to, provide for kids who want to have sex change operations. I mean, that resonated with a lot of Latinos.
That was probably also big in Spanish language radio. Mm-hmm. When I did a story about evangelical, famous evangelicals having revivals in South Texas, no, they didn't want any advertising in any newspaper. When I asked questions, I wasn't, I didn't get callbacks because this is sort of the secret intel, like they make their way around places like Eagle Pass, where the Operation Lone Star continues to make huge changes down there, to little pueblitos where they got on Spanish language radio, and they have their Spanish language cohorts going on there and telling the story of brimstone and hell, and why they need to vote Republican.
What's interesting is because, growing up, everybody's always said Latinos are conservative, they should be Republican. They just don't know it. And it feels like in the last 4 years, the Republicans were way better about providing that message to the conservative Latinos.
That, I think, was one of the Democrats' biggest downfalls in Texas. They've been trying to make headway for years within different population centers throughout the state. And I think for a long time, they considered the Rio Grande Valley a given, that they're always going to support us just because Latinos support Democrats. That is not true, especially now. As Nora's mentioning, more conservative values.
They're military. They love the military.
And now Latinos feel like that they have a bit more of a seat at the table, and it seems like the Republican Party kind of jumped on that more than Democrats did. And so I would venture to guess that a lot of people probably down in the valley, because we saw so many of those traditionally blue counties switch over to red, that they were being listened to more by Republicans that were making the trip down there than Democrats who may have, the Democratic Party rather, that had just said, they're okay for now, when that just was not the case.
And this is overshadowed by the bigger story, right? Forgive me, Nora, but we have a former president going back into the White House, and he is a convicted felon who remains out on bail on sexual assault charges and so many other ills, and who instigated and supported an insurrection. To me, that is the story of the year. That as a population, we decided to look beyond all of his downfall, his business downfall, his personal failings, and elected a convicted felon.
I'm just as shocked as you are about that. But it felt in the weeks leading up to the election that everything was, about those hot button issues, the economy and immigration. And those were the issues that it seems like people feel, I don't know, this is just me grasping at trying to understand, felt were more important than whatever his personal problems are.
But more important than ensuring that Social Security remains in place, that Medicare and Medicaid survive, that people whom we all love in our South Texas families, who are, some of them now elderly, are going to continue to be supported by the money that they themselves put aside. That's what's been hard to deal with.
I think regardless of what party somebody normally aligns with, the number of people who just did not vote in this election was enormous, especially compared to 2020. Whether that's people that are feeling disengaged or were just tired of the noise, or maybe felt like they did not have enough information to be able to go make that choice. It was really interesting to see the turnout throughout the state, especially like in early voting, when you had, our Bexar County Elections Administrator Jackie Callanan talking about the record number of people that were turning out during early voting, that were, it's like the highest number of people ever on the first day of early voting. And that seemed to continue for the first few days, but ultimately it came out as being less than 2020. And I think one of the things that people don't necessarily consider is that during early voting in 2020, there were more days of early
Yes.
voting because of the pandemic. And, there was less time for people to go vote this time. The highly energized folks, they were out there day one. They were going out, showing out in massive numbers, long 2-hour
It
lines.
seemed really good at first.
And then election day was just low as well. And I can only really speak to Bexar County because that's where we're watching very heavily. But throughout the state and throughout the country, voting just was not as high as people were expecting. And, I hope there are studies done to asking people why they decided not to vote
And then voting rights will be an issue for the Republican Party that's already gearing up to make, like, for example, state ID laws even more restrictive and more widespread, way beyond those states that have already incorporated them, like Texas. Okay. The other big story in the state was Operation Lone Star, Eagle Pass, Shelby Park, Border Patrol people being probably exhausted about standing at the border.
At TPR, we did extensive reporting on Operation Lone Star. A lot of that credit goes to David Martin Davies, and then our military and veterans affairs reporter, Gabriela Ocorta Solorio, who last month she had done a story on the 17 National Guardsmen who had died during Operation Lone Star, some of them through drowning deaths, some of them through suicide. And so she was really trying to paint a picture as to what some of these Guards members were going through this massive operation that the governor put forward. So I highly recommend folks that would like to know more about the impact that it has had on some of the Guardsmen to go look at Gabby's story from last month.
Nora?
The Washington Post, too, was it in conjunction with that project that they did the story about really all the people who died in drown?
Well, this was done through the American Homefront Project, which is a collaboration of public radio stations, a handful of public radio stations across the country and through NPR. So a lot of work went into that through the American Homefront Project.
That is a serious issue. All of the drownings and has been problematic. I don't know what the solutions will ultimately be. As somebody who would travel down to the border quite often in Edinburgh, you really don't see that much of the impact. It's really more right on the border, as we saw it in Eagle Pass when there was that big group that came forward. And was that this past year?
Yes,
It was this year. And I think when you have groups like that coming across, that does shine a spotlight on it.
When you see a crisis.
When you see a crisis and you had 10,000 people camping out.
And
Then
the great majority were from places unlike previous immigrants. They were from Venezuela and other war-torn and really countries that are having a very hard time just feeding its people.
In 2021, we saw the 14,000 people under the National Bridge in Del Rio from Haiti.
That's right. I just don't know when our Congress will get to the point where they are willing to come up with some kind of a program to address some of these issues, as they had. And then they were discouraged from voting on it by President Trump. So it will remain to be seen if it will be revived, if the immigration plan will be revived. But that's really what is needed. We need some kind of plan to address it and to help some of these folks who are coming to our borders legally and legally asking and requesting asylum.
That is legal, and I think lots of readers do not know
They
that.
do not understand that, and everybody uses the term, illegals, and no, these people were legally asking for asylum, and that is the process that we have that exists right now. So we got to come up with something better.
And I think the next Congress, we're going to see a lot more draconian measures with trying to eliminate the problem rather than address the problem.
That's right.
That's one of the hard line stances that we've seen a lot of people that were running for Congress that will be in the next Congress take when it came to immigration. And so there will be, I imagine, a lot more stricter policies of just trying to stop people
Yes.
coming in rather than trying to address some of the underlying issues.
That's right. It's all going to be about backlash. And it's probably going to get a lot worse before it gets better.
It will get worse. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's
I'm
okay.
just saying that Trump's already been through this once before, and there were no consequences. Maybe there were immediately, but not 4 years later. So I agree with Joey. I think it's going to be even worse this time around in terms of the efforts to stop it.
And which will lead to other issues that will stop the flow of goods and services and people, which will affect us dramatically, especially when you think of tariffs and how our prices are already soaring due to inflation. They're likely to go up higher.
And with the plan to, quote, to deport millions of people, you'll see probably folks who that might be on DACA or might be have other means of staying that just maybe not want to be a part of like the general American society, because there will probably be a lot of fear of some of these new measures that might come in place that could put them or their family in jeopardy of being deported. So I think that you might see people who are otherwise very present in our communities start to withdraw a bit.
And the fear, I think, among those families that are of mixed status is probably the highest when you know that two members of the family, which is extended and includes many U.S. citizens, there's two that don't have status. And they're already living literally on the borderline, and that will become even tougher. Every time they drive, every time they get on public transportation, every time they're registered for school or they go to a hospital.
And I can only speak to this anecdotally, just things that I've read online. There are people who were criticized for voting for President Trump that are part of those mixed status families, and they believe that if that plan to deport millions of people comes to fruition, they entered the voting booth thinking, oh, that won't happen to my family.
It's all the others.
There's no guarantee, though, of what these programs are going to end up looking like.
That's right. Okay. We'll get back to one issue that you mentioned before, Joey, and that's the Democratic Party's failures across the state. That ended up most apparent in South Texas, but also with the state party leader, Gilberto Hinojosa, resigning. And I think we should address what the Democratic Party ought to be doing in what appears like huge failure across the country. Nora, you've been a political writer and a political editor for a very long time. I don't think we've ever been at this sort of precipice.
No, I think when Biden, in a few months in summer, unveiled some proposals to try to address some things, and he was buoyed in the polls by it, I was not surprised by that. And I think the Democrats need to do a much better job of acknowledging the immigration influx and the problem, acknowledging that it exists and that people are afraid, and trying to address it. And I don't think they have. I think falling back on, but we're a nation of immigrants, we should always be welcoming, is just an oversimplification of the problem. And they need to address the concerns of people here who do believe that we are being overrun.
And the immigration system runs by rules. Yeah. You just have to make more of them or make them more clear, and then people have to follow them. And there are plenty of people who have been through San Antonio, and they've been cleared at the border, and a year later, I'll find out from some of the San Antonio people that helped them say, yeah, he was ultimately deported because he didn't meet the standard. And maybe the standard is unfair, but it is there. And so people don't understand also that some of these immigrants do get deported.
Yeah.
Over the next 4 years or 2 years, the Democratic Party is going to have to do a lot of rebuilding for itself because, after Vice President Harris's defeat in November, the party does not have a clear leader right now. You have those that are still in Congress, but they are up there in age. Think of, for instance, Nancy Pelosi, who is in her 80s. And so the Democratic Party is going to have to really start looking for people that are going to be like the next faces of the party. A lot of the younger folks will start looking towards AOC, potentially
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez
yes.
of New York.
And also potentially Greg Casar. He's brand new, but Joaquin Castro has made a name for himself within the party.
And very effective at getting things done on the edges of leadership.
And there's Hakeem Jeffries. And so they're really going to have to look at what they can do to try to still sway the younger voters that are out there that are starting to lean more conservative and more Republican. And so that is really what the Democratic Party is, at least from my perspective, is going to have to look at so that way they do not fall further than they have already appeared to have done.
They need to try to find a way to swing a little bit more, way more centrist, because for some reason, a lot of Democrats, especially my family and friends from the Valley, they really believe that the Democratic Party is just too liberal. It's too liberal on immigration. It's too liberal on all the social issues. And I think that's what's turning some away as well.
I think that also the Democratic Party needs to let go of some of its buy into generational change. We are facing this issue in every industry, right? I include myself in there too. So I am going to retire soon, but not just yet. So we all need a fresh start and a reboot. And you don't get that by 80-year-olds hanging on to jobs that they should, if you want to remain in Congress and you get elected, remain in Congress, but let others begin to learn to lead. And I'm very frustrated. I'm frustrated as a voter that the Republicans have changed and altered, but the Democrats have not, and sort of stuck to a formula that has continued to not pay off. Anyway.
I agree.
Okay, speaking of Democrats, one of the other big stories of the year was Henry Cuellar, who was reelected in November, but still faces bribery and money laundering charges. Nora?
I don't know. It's the same thing. It's the same Trump effect.
Yeah.
I don't know if people maybe are finding candidates like this somewhat more relatable.
That's sad.
Yeah, in that they're flawed, they're facing problems, and just like you and I, and so they're willing to continue to give them a chance.
All right, Joey,
so
come on.
Looking at some of that, just from what we've seen here locally, I think back to Carlos Uresti when he was in federal court. The people after the conviction, it was persona non grata. We don't necessarily see that anymore when people are facing convictions or certain issues within the legal system. As we've seen with President Trump, with
Paxton.
Oh, yeah.
We haven't seen.
God, he has not faced his day in court yet.
And even here locally, I'm thinking of Councilman Clayton Perry, Councilman Mark White, both who back to back, within maybe a year of each other, got DWI charges. Granted, the outcomes were probation and I can't remember exactly.
And the behavior was very different.
Yeah, and so in years past, when people were facing things like that, ultimately they would resign
and would fade away in terms of power. And what will stick? You wonder how far does any one politician need to go to be sort of really outed? It's getting more difficult. Perhaps our tolerance is up, or we relate to them, as you said.
That's the only explanation I can think of, that people feel they are relatable in some way, that they are, they are facing the same type of,
Adversity.
Yes.
Okay, so I want to finish up with something more fun. Those are really not all the biggest issues of the year, but there's some of them. And that's movies. Probably one of my favorite topics all year long are movies. So I have a couple of favorites, but Joey, tell us at least one of yours.
So this, not to sound like a stereotypical gay, Wicked was great. Wicked was amazing. I really enjoyed it. I had seen Wicked when it was at the Majestic several years ago. I really like the fact that it's being split up into two movies to go kind of deeper into the stories, because basically the movie that we saw just a couple of weeks ago was in essence the same length as the musical, but now you're going to get to see a lot more from the...
And they drop little nuggets of information that kind of tell you how things are going to go.
And so I'm really sad I did not get to see Beetlejuice when it was in theaters, so that's still on my list. Recently saw Queer with Daniel Craig. That was a very trippy movie, very good, and
he was good in it?
Yeah. And something I am interested in next year, just because it just stands out. Popeye the Sailor just became in the public domain. And so rather than Popeye the Sailor Man next year, there is supposedly a movie that is coming out called Popeye the Slayer Man, which will be a slasher film. So
you can tell our generational divide right here, Joey. All right, Nora, which one did you like?
I hardly got out to the movies this past year, unfortunately. But I did go see Wicked, and I've never seen the Broadway production of Wicked.
So good.
So I went in totally not knowing anything at all. A general understanding of what that it's about. The origin story, if you will, of the Wicked Witch of the East. But I have a lot of questions, like her sister, how does she become the Wicked Witch of the West? I'm hoping that's going to be answered in the next movie.
There is a whole backstory to it. I've only seen snippets from the book part, but it's I don't want to spoil anything, but it's wild.
But the production
is
so great.
It was amazing. The cinematography, everything was just
the perfection of every little thing.
Gorgeous.
And so I want to blow your mind for a second.
Okay.
So you have in the Wicked movie that just came out, you have already seen the Scarecrow and the Tin Man. And you have already seen the Cowardly Lion. You have already seen that. I don't want to spoil it, but you have already seen them.
Well, you've already seen it, and after off of air, we'll tell you a couple.
Okay.
That they were just little drops into the plot that you can now see who is going to be who.
Yeah.
But I have two favorites, and I got to see them over the holidays, and I saw a couple of movies throughout the year, but these were, they always save the best for the last, right before nominations, and it was Conclave, about the new old Pope dying and new Pope rising, and it is the most complicated, most well-written, most well-acted religious movie, and I was a religion writer for many years, and it is just an amazing film. You must see it. It's no longer in theaters. You can see it on Peacock at the moment. It'll probably be streaming in other places. The other movie, which I'm going to get back to the theater and see probably this weekend, is A Complete Unknown, the Bob Dylan story. And again, picture perfect. Everyone in the movie that took on these roles sang, played guitar, played harmonica, and they did it live. And it is really quite good. And I think you'll enjoy it.
Can't
So
wait.
those are my recommendations out there to Movie Land. Thanks for being on, the both of you. You can watch the video version of Nosotros on YouTube and listen to it anywhere you get your podcast. My Metro column appears on Wednesdays and Fridays in the Express News, and if you want to reach me, my email address is eayala@express-news.net. Thanks for listening, and join us next time on Nosotros.